Tonight we begin with a question that might keep you up. What if I told you that everything you think you know about pirates is a carefully constructed lie designed to sell you theme park tickets and Johnny Depp movies? Picture this. You're standing on a weathered dock in Port Royal, Jamaica, in the year 1697. And the air smells like a combination of rotting fish, human waste, and the particularly sweet stench of gangrene wafting from the harbor. You've just signed articles with Captain Henry Morgan's crew, not because you're seeking adventure or treasure, but because you're a starving dock worker who got drunk on watered-down rum and woke up to find that you'd agreed to board the pirate ship anchored 300 yards offshore. That romantic notion of freedom on the high seas? Let's be clear. You've just sold yourself into one of the most brutal, disease-ridden, and short-lived careers in human history. Forget the treasure maps and the eye patches Hollywood sold you, because the reality of pirate life makes a medieval dungeon look like a 4-star resort. You're about to discover that the average pirate survived less than 2 years after joining a crew. And those 2 years were filled with malnutrition, constant violence, tropical diseases that would make modern doctors vomit, and a legal system that considered hanging you from the gallows while your body was still twitching to be a merciful end. The swagger you've seen in movies. That's a man trying to walk on legs, ravaged by scurvy while his teeth fall out into his morning gruel. The buried treasure? Most pirates died penniless, their shares spent on rum within hours of making port, their bodies dumped into the ocean to save the cost of a burial. The freedom. You've just traded one master for a captain who can legally shoot you in the head for refusing an order, and a crew that will happily throw you overboard if they suspect you're hiding an extra coin. Tonight, we're going to walk through a single day in your new life as a 1700 pirate. And I promise you this, by the time we're done, you'll be kissing the ground beneath your modern feet and thanking whatever deity you believe in that you were born in an era with antibiotics, labor laws, and the basic human right to not have your limbs sawed off with a rusty blade while your shipmates hold you down, and your only anesthetic is a leather strap to bite down on. So let's ease into this journey together, shall we? Let's talk about what it really meant to be a pirate in the golden age of piracy, when the Caribbean Sea was less a tropical paradise and more a floating graveyard where desperate men went to die slowly while pretending they were free. If you'd like more stories like this one, please subscribe so you don't miss any new uploads. I'd also love to hear from you. Let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time of day you're tuning in. Your first morning aboard the ship begins at 4 in the morning. Except nobody calls it 4 in the morning because time is measured by bells that clang so loudly your skull feels like it's splitting in half. And the concept of sleeping until a reasonable hour died the moment you stepped onto this floating prison. You're lying in the berth deck, which is a generous term for what's essentially a wooden cave barely 5 feet high, where 70 unwashed men are crammed together like sardines in a tin that's been left in the sun for 3 weeks. The smell hits you first. It's not just body odor, though. That's certainly present in quantities that would violate multiple international conventions, if those existed. But a nauseating cocktail of vomit, urine, feces, rotting food, bilge water, and something you can't quite identify but later learn is the smell of tropical rot-eating through the ship's wooden hull. You try to sit up and immediately crack your head on the low ceiling, which is standard procedure for new crew members and causes the men around you to laugh in a way that makes it clear they're not laughing with you, but at the fresh meat who still has all his teeth. The hammock you're sleeping in, which you share with two other men on a rotating basis, because the ship doesn't have enough hammocks for everyone, is made from canvas so filthy it's stiff with accumulated grime. And you're pretty sure something living just crawled across your leg. You swing out of the hammock and your feet hit the deck, which is covered in at least 2 inches of liquid you desperately hope is just seawater that's leaked through the hull. But the smell suggests otherwise. The temperature down here is already approaching 90 degrees Fahrenheit. And the humidity is so thick you feel like you're breathing through a wet blanket made of someone else's exhalations. There are no windows, no ventilation, no fresh air whatsoever. The only light comes from a few tallow candles that fill the space with smoke and the nauseating smell of burning animal fat. You're wearing the same clothes you boarded in 3 days ago, and you'll continue wearing them for the next 6 months because pirates don't have changes of clothing. They have the rags currently rotting on their bodies and nothing else. Your shirt, which was once white or maybe cream-colored, is now a shade of brown-gray that suggests it's given up on life. Your breeches are stiff with salt, sweat, and substances you'd rather not identify. You don't have shoes because you sold them for rum before boarding, and walking barefoot on a ship means your feet are constantly covered in splinters, cuts, and infections that will eventually lead to gangrene if you're unlucky. The breakfast bell rings, and 70 men surge toward the ladder that leads to the upper deck, like rats fleeing a sinking ship. Which is ironic because this ship is actually sinking, just very slowly. You climb the ladder, which is slippery with substances you're trying hard not to think about, and emerge onto the main deck where the morning sun hits you like a physical slap. The upper deck is chaos incarnate, a wooden stage where human misery performs its daily show for an audience of seagulls and the occasional passing merchant vessel that will soon regret crossing paths with your ship. The sun is already brutal despite the early hour, beating down on the deck with the kind of intensity that makes you understand why every pirate you've seen has skin that looks like leather left in the desert for a decade. There's no shade except for a few areas beneath the sails, and those spots are already claimed by the senior crew members who will kill you if you try to take their place. The deck itself is a minefield of hazards. Coiled ropes that will trip you, cannons that will crush you if they break loose, pools of tar that will stick to your already destroyed feet, and splinters the size of your finger jutting up from boards that haven't been properly maintained in years. The first order of business is breakfast, which is announced by the ship's cook, a one-eyed man named Bartholomew, who lost his leg to a shark and his sanity to whatever hell he experienced before joining this crew. He's standing over a massive pot that's been sitting in the sun since yesterday, and he's ladling out what can only generously be called food into wooden bowls that haven't been washed since the ship left port 6 months ago. The meal is salt pork, which sounds almost appetizing until you see it. Chunks of meat so heavily salted that eating it will make your tongue swell. So old that it's turned a gray-green color that suggests it's achieving sentience. And so hard that you'll need to soak it in your mouth for 5 minutes before your teeth can make any impact. Accompanying this delicacy is ship's biscuit, also known as hardtack, which is essentially a brick made of flour and water that's been baked until it achieves the consistency of concrete. These biscuits are infested with weevils, small beetles that have made homes in the air pockets, and the general rule is that you tap the biscuit against the deck to knock out the bugs before eating. Though most men don't bother because the weevils are protein, and at this point, protein is protein. You get your ration, which is barely enough to sustain a child, let alone a grown man who's about to spend 12 hours doing back-breaking labor. And you find a spot on the deck to sit and choke it down. The salt pork tastes like the ocean decided to punish you personally. And the biscuit requires so much jaw strength to chew that you're pretty sure you've cracked a tooth. Around you, 70 other men are having the same experience. Their faces reflecting the kind of resignation that comes from knowing this is the best meal you'll have all day. Some of the older pirates have learned to dip their biscuits in rum to soften them. But rum rations don't come until noon. So you're stuck gnawing on this culinary nightmare while the sun climbs higher and your skin begins its daily transformation into something resembling a lobster that's been left on a grill too long. Breakfast ends not because you finished eating, but because the quartermaster, a massive brute named Samuel, who has a scar running from his forehead to his chin and the disposition of a rabid bear, starts shouting orders that make it clear your time for leisure has expired. The quartermaster is second in command on a pirate ship, and his job is to ensure that every man does his assigned work or faces consequences that range from flogging to being marooned on a deserted island with nothing but a pistol loaded with a single shot, so you can choose between starvation and suicide. Your assignment, as the newest and therefore lowest-ranking member of the crew, is pumping the bilge, which is exactly as terrible as it sounds and somehow worse than you can imagine. The bilge is the lowest part of the ship, below even the berth deck where you slept. And it's where all the water that leaks through the hull collects along with everything else that drips, falls, or flows downward. You descend another ladder into darkness so complete that you need to carry a lantern. And the smell that hits you makes the berth deck seem like a field of fresh flowers in comparison. This is the concentrated essence of every disgusting thing on the ship. Seawater mixed with human waste from the heads that don't seal properly, vomit from seasick crew members, food scraps that have rotted into a liquid state, dead rats that have decomposed into the consistency of pudding, and a special ingredient that makes this truly special. Bilge water, which is seawater that's been sitting in the bottom of the ship for months, fermenting in the tropical heat, developing its own ecosystem of bacteria and fungi that science won't classify for another 200 years. Your job is to work the pump, which is a manual device that requires you to push and pull a wooden handle for hours on end to move this toxic soup from the bilge up to the deck, where it's dumped overboard. You're working in near total darkness, standing in water that comes up to your knees. Water that's so foul it burns your skin where you have cuts and scrapes, which is everywhere. Because life on a ship is just one long series of minor injuries that never heal properly. The pump handle is slippery with slime, and every stroke requires your full body weight, because the mechanism is old and poorly maintained and fighting against the suction of the water it's trying to move. You work for 4 hours straight without a break, your arms screaming in agony, your back developing knots that feel like someone's tied your muscles into sailor's knots, your legs cramping from standing in the contaminated water, and your lungs burning from breathing air so thick with methane and decay that you're essentially suffocating slowly while still technically breathing. Around you in the darkness, rats the size of cats swim through the bilge water, and you've already been bitten 3 times, which means you'll develop rat bite fever in about a week, which means you'll spend 3 days shivering with a fever of 104 degrees, while your shipmates debate whether you're sick enough to excuse from duties or just lazy when you finally emerge from the bilge 4 hours later. You're covered in substances that would require a hazmat team to properly classify. And your fellow crew members give you a wide berth, not out of respect, but because you smell like death marinated in sewage and left to ferment in Satan's armpit. There's no opportunity to clean yourself because fresh water is more valuable than gold on a pirate ship. Rationed at 1 gallon per man per day for all purposes, including drinking, cooking, and the occasional attempt at hygiene that most men gave up on months ago. Seawater is plentiful, but bathing in seawater leaves you crusted with salt that crystallizes in every crevice of your body and makes your skin crack and bleed. So most pirates simply accept that they're going to smell like a biological weapon and move on with their lives. Your next assignment is working the sails, which requires you to climb the rigging to a height of 60 feet above the deck on ropes that are slippery with sea spray and worn thin from years of use and lack of maintenance. You're barefoot, remember? Because you sold your shoes for rum, and climbing rope barefoot means every step is an exercise in pain. As the rough hemp cuts into your feet and the old blood from previous climbers makes the rope sticky. There's no safety equipment, no harnesses, no nets to catch you if you fall. Just the deck 60 feet below, waiting to break every bone in your body when you inevitably lose your grip. The wind up here is constant and strong, whipping your already destroyed shirt around your body and trying its best to pry you loose from your precarious perch like a child trying to shake fruit from a tree. Your job is to adjust the sails based on shouted orders from the deck below, which means untying knots with fingers that are already cramping from your bilge pump session, hauling on ropes that weigh more than you do, and somehow not falling to your death while performing complex tasks at a height that would make modern safety inspectors have simultaneous heart attacks. Below you, the ocean stretches to the horizon in all directions, beautiful in a way that's completely lost on you because you're too focused on not dying to appreciate natural beauty. The sun is directly overhead now, turning the deck into a griddle, and the metal fittings on the rigging into branding irons that will burn your skin if you accidentally touch them. You're working alongside other crew members who have been doing this for years. Men who move through the rigging like spiders, their bodies lean and hard from constant labor, their hands calloused to the point where they're essentially wearing leather gloves made of their own skin. They don't help you because helping the new guy is a good way to end up doing his work forever. And besides, if you can't handle this, you'll die soon enough, and they'll get your share of whatever plunder the ship takes. So there's really no incentive to keep you alive beyond the basic crew requirements. The afternoon brings what passes for a meal on a pirate ship, which is more salt pork, more hardtack, and if you're lucky, a handful of dried peas that have been sitting in a barrel for so long, they've developed their own civilization of weevils and grain beetles. The peas need to be soaked in water for hours before they're even remotely edible. But there's no time for such luxuries, so you eat them hard, crunching through them like you're chewing gravel while your jaw makes sounds that suggest it's filing for divorce from your face. The highlight of the afternoon meal is the rum ration, which is served in a small tin cup that holds maybe 4 ounces of liquid that's technically rum, but tastes more like paint thinner mixed with regret and the tears of everyone who's ever drunk it. This rum has been watered down to the point where it's more water than rum, a practice that's supposedly to make it last longer, but really just means you're drinking disappointing water that burns on the way down. You drink it anyway, because it's the only thing that makes the constant pain of existence on this ship even remotely bearable. And because if you don't drink your ration, someone else will steal it, and then you'll have to fight them And fighting on a ship means someone's probably going overboard, and you need every crew member you have because the ship is always undermanned and overworked. After the meal, you're assigned to scraping barnacles off the hull, which requires the ship to be partially beached or careened, a process that involves sailing into shallow water and deliberately tipping the ship on its side so the hull is exposed. You're given a scraping tool that's essentially a sharpened piece of metal attached to a wooden handle. And your job is to remove the thousands of barnacles that have attached themselves to the wooden hull below the waterline. Barnacles that slow the ship down and need to be removed regularly, or the ship becomes so sluggish it can't catch merchant vessels or outrun naval warships. You work in the blazing sun, standing in knee-deep water that's filled with the barnacles you've just scraped off, which have sharp edges that cut your legs every time you move, creating hundreds of small cuts that will become infected because you're standing in water that's essentially a bacterial soup. The scraping is backbreaking work, requiring you to bend over at an awkward angle for hours, your lower back screaming in agony, your hands developing blisters on top of the blisters you already have from the bilge pump and the rigging work, blisters that pop and bleed, and then develop new blisters in a never-ending cycle of tissue damage that your body can't heal because you're malnourished and living in conditions that actively prevent healing. Around you, other crew members are doing the same work. And occasionally someone cuts themselves badly enough that blood flows into the water, which attracts sharks, which adds an extra element of terror to an already miserable task, because now you're working while keeping one eye on the water for the telltale fin that means you're about to become lunch for a creature that hasn't eaten in days and finds desperate pirates quite tasty. Evening brings no relief from the labor, only a shift in the type of misery you're experiencing. The ship is back in deeper water now, and your next assignment is working with the carpenter to repair damage to the deck. Damage that's accumulated from months of neglect, cannon fire during the last engagement with a Spanish merchant vessel, and the general wear and tear that comes from having 70 men living on what's essentially a wooden box that's constantly being attacked by the ocean. The carpenter is a man named Willem, who has all of his limbs, which makes him practically a medical miracle among the crew. And he's teaching you how to replace rotten planks in the deck, using tools that would make a modern carpenter weep. The saw is so dull you're essentially tearing the wood apart rather than cutting it. The hammer has a head that's coming loose from the handle and will probably fly off and kill someone eventually. And the nails are hand-forged pieces of metal that are bent at various angles and need to be straightened before use. You're working as the sun sets, which sounds romantic until you realize that sunset on a ship means the mosquitoes come out. And Caribbean mosquitoes are not the delicate insects you might encounter in a temperate climate, but rather winged demons the size of small birds that carry diseases with names like yellow fever, malaria, and dengue fever. Diseases that will kill you slowly and painfully while you hallucinate and your organs shut down one by one. The mosquitoes swarm around you in clouds so thick you're breathing them in, and each bite leaves a welt that itches so intensely you'll scratch it until it bleeds, and then it will become infected, and then you'll have another festering wound to add to your collection. You're hammering nails into the new deck plank when your hand slips, and the hammer comes down on your thumb with enough force to split the nail, which is exactly as painful as it sounds, and possibly more so. Blood immediately wells up under the nail, turning it black, and the pain is so intense you see stars and nearly pass out. But passing out means you can't work, and not working means you don't eat tomorrow. So you wrap your thumb in a piece of cloth torn from your already destroyed shirt and keep working while waves of nausea wash over you and your vision goes blurry around the edges. Willem doesn't even look up from his work because injuries like this are so common they're not worth commenting on. And besides, you still have 9 other fingers and 2 thumbs if you count the one that's probably going to fall off in a few days when the infection really takes hold. Night falls completely, and with it comes a brief period that's optimistically called rest time. Though rest is a relative term when you're on a pirate ship where the work never truly stops and something is always trying to kill you. You return to the berth deck, which has somehow gotten even more disgusting in the hours since you left it this morning. The heat of the day having baked the accumulated filth into new and exciting forms of biological horror. Your hammock is occupied by one of the men who works the opposite shift, so you find a clear spot on the deck boards, which is to say, you find a spot that's only slightly less covered in human waste than the surrounding areas. And you lie down using a coiled rope as a pillow, because actual pillows are a luxury reserved for the captain and maybe the quartermaster if he's feeling fancy. Your thumb is throbbing in rhythm with your heartbeat, each pulse sending a fresh wave of pain up your arm. And you're pretty sure you can feel it swelling even though you can't see it in the darkness. Sleep should come easily given that you've been awake for 18 hours doing backbreaking labor. But sleep on a pirate ship is constantly interrupted by the sounds of 70 men snoring, coughing, vomiting, fighting, having nightmares, and engaging in activities that we won't detail here but involve bodily functions that polite society pretends don't happen in shared spaces. The ship itself is constantly making noise. The wood creaking and groaning as the vessel rides the ocean swells. The rigging making sounds like tortured violins as the wind plays through it. The occasional rat scurrying past your head on its way to somewhere presumably important in the rat community. You've just managed to drift into something resembling sleep when the alarm bell rings. 3 sharp clangs that mean one thing. Another ship has been spotted on the horizon, and it's time to determine whether it's a potential prize worth chasing or a naval warship that will hang you all from the yardarm for the crime of being pirates. Every man scrambles to his feet, the berth deck becoming a chaos of bodies moving in the darkness, men tripping over each other, cursing, fighting for access to the ladder that leads to the upper deck. You're swept up in the surge of humanity. Your injured thumb getting smashed against someone's elbow, sending fresh pain shooting through your arm and making you bite your tongue hard enough to taste blood. You emerge onto the deck to find the crew assembling at their battle stations, which in your case means the cannon you've been assigned to. A massive iron beast that weighs 3,000 pounds and will crush you flat if it breaks loose from its moorings during the chaos of battle. The cannon you're assigned to is a 6-pounder, which refers to the weight of the cannonball it fires, and your role in the gun crew is the most dangerous one. You're the powder monkey, the person responsible for running below deck to the powder magazine, retrieving bags of gunpowder, and running them back to the cannon during battle while cannonballs from the enemy ship are turning your shipmates into fine red mist. But we're getting ahead of ourselves, because first the captain needs to determine whether the ship on the horizon is worth chasing. And that determination is made by the lookout. A man perched in the crow's nest 90 feet above the deck who has the unenviable job of staring at the horizon in all weather conditions while trying not to fall to his death. The lookout shouts down that the ship appears to be a merchant vessel, which causes a cheer to go up from the crew because merchant vessels mean plunder. And plunder means the slim possibility that you might actually get paid for all this suffering you're experiencing. The captain orders the pursuit, and suddenly the ship transforms from a floating prison into a racing machine as every sail is deployed. And the crew works together with an efficiency that would be impressive if it wasn't motivated by pure greed and the desire to commit acts of maritime violence. You're sent up the rigging again, your injured thumb screaming in protest as you grip the ropes. And your job is to help deploy the top-gallant sails, which are the highest sails on the ship and therefore the most dangerous to work with because you're 90 feet above the deck in the darkness, with only the stars and a few deck lanterns providing light. The ship is moving fast now, cutting through the waves with a grace that seems impossible for something this large and ungainly. And every time the ship hits a wave, the entire rigging system shudders and sways, trying its best to shake you loose like a dog trying to remove fleas. Below you, the deck is a hive of activity as men prepare weapons, load cannons, sharpen cutlasses, and engage in the pre-battle rituals that humans have been performing since the first person decided that hitting another person with a rock was an effective way to acquire their possessions. The merchant ship is trying to run, its own sails deployed. But pirate ships are faster because they're not loaded down with cargo, and they're crewed by men who are motivated by the very real threat of starvation if they don't capture prizes regularly. The chase lasts 2 hours, 2 hours during which you remain in the rigging, your muscles cramping, your injured thumb now swollen to twice its normal size, your feet bleeding from dozens of new cuts from the rope, and your mind calculating whether the potential plunder is worth the very real possibility that you're about to die in the next 30 minutes. The pirate ship finally catches the merchant vessel just before dawn, and the actual process of boarding is nothing like the choreographed sword fights you've seen in movies, but rather a chaotic nightmare of violence, screaming, and the very real possibility of death from multiple sources simultaneously. The pirate ship pulls alongside the merchant vessel, and men throw grappling hooks to lash the two ships together. Hooks that frequently miss and need to be thrown again while the merchant crew tries to cut the ropes and the pirate crew fires muskets at anyone who gets close to the ropes. You're still assigned to the powder magazine because someone decided that the newest crew member should have the job most likely to result in catastrophic death if something goes wrong. And going wrong in this context means the powder magazine exploding and turning the entire aft section of the ship into splinters while you're inside it. The cannons fire, each blast so loud it feels like someone punched you in the chest with a fist made of pure sound. The concussion wave strong enough to make your ears ring and your vision blur. The smell of gunpowder fills the air, thick and choking, mixing with the smell of burning wood where cannonballs have hit and started fires on both ships. You run below deck, your injured thumb forgotten in the adrenaline rush, grab a powder bag that weighs 20 pounds and could explode if you drop it too hard or if a spark from one of the many fires gets close to it, and run back to your cannon while men are screaming and dying around you. A musket ball zips past your head so close you feel the air displacement, and you realize with absolute clarity that you're probably going to die in the next 5 minutes, and there's nothing you can do about it except keep running powder to the cannon and hope that the Spanish merchant crew surrenders before you catch a musket ball in the chest. The merchant ship does surrender after 20 minutes of bombardment, their captain making the rational decision that his cargo isn't worth dying for. And the pirate crew swarms aboard like locusts, searching for anything valuable, while the merchant crew huddles on deck trying to look as non-threatening as possible, so they don't get killed for sport. You follow your shipmates on to the merchant vessel, stepping over bodies of merchants who weren't fast enough to stop fighting when the surrender was called. And you participate in the looting because if you don't, you won't get a share of the plunder. And you need that share because it's the only payment you're going to receive for months of suffering. The treasure turns out to be barrels of salted fish, bolts of cloth that are already showing mold damage from the tropical humidity, and exactly one small chest of Spanish silver coins that the entire crew will have to divide among 70 men, meaning your share will be enough to buy maybe 3 bottles of rum when you make port, assuming you survive that long. The aftermath of the battle brings a new kind of misery that somehow manages to be worse than the actual fighting, because now you're dealing with the consequences of violence, rather than the adrenaline-fueled chaos that at least had the courtesy to distract you from thinking too hard about what you were doing. The merchant ship needs to be stripped of everything valuable, which means every barrel, every crate, every piece of rope, every nail, every plank of wood that can be pried loose without sinking. The vessel needs to be transferred to the pirate ship. And this work falls to the lowest-ranking crew members, which includes you. You spend the next 6 hours hauling cargo between ships, walking across a plank that's been laid between the vessels, a plank that's slippery with blood and seawater and exactly as stable as you'd imagine a piece of wood suspended over the ocean would be. Each trip across is a small exercise in terror because the ocean is right there, 10 feet below. And if you fall in while carrying a heavy barrel, you're going to sink like a stone because nobody taught you to swim. And even if they had, swimming with a barrel of salted fish is not a skill anyone has mastered. The bodies of the dead merchants are still on the deck, and nobody bothers to move them because moving bodies is work, and there's already enough work to do with the cargo transfer. So you step over corpses that are already starting to bloat in the tropical heat, their faces frozen in expressions that range from surprise to absolute terror. Their blood creating sticky patches on the deck that make your already uncertain footing even more precarious. One of the bodies is a boy who can't be more than 14 years old. Probably a cabin boy like you would have been if you'd signed onto a merchant vessel instead of a pirate ship. And he's missing most of his head from a musket ball that caught him at close range. And you vomit when you see him, your meager breakfast of salt pork and hardtack coming back up in a burning rush that makes your throat feel like you've swallowed broken glass. Your shipmates laugh at you for being soft, for having a weak stomach, for not being able to handle the reality of pirate life. And their laughter is cruel, in the way that only people who have completely given up on empathy can achieve. The cargo transfer takes all day, and by the time it's finished, you've made 50 trips across that blood-slick plank, carrying loads that weigh anywhere from 30 to 100 pounds. Your back screaming in agony, your legs trembling with exhaustion, your injured thumb now infected to the point where red streaks are running up your arm toward your heart, which you dimly understand means blood poisoning and probably death within a week if the infection isn't treated. And of course, there's no treatment available except amputation if it gets bad enough. And amputation on a pirate ship means the ship's carpenter taking a saw to your arm while you're held down by 4 men and given a leather strap to bite on instead of anesthesia. When the cargo transfer is finally complete and the merchant vessel has been stripped of everything worth taking, the pirate crew faces a decision about what to do with the merchant sailors. And this decision reveals the true nature of pirate democracy, which is less about fairness and more about mob rule with a thin veneer of voting procedures. The captain calls for a vote on whether to kill the merchants, maroon them on a deserted island, or let them sail away in their now empty ship. and you quickly learn that voting on a pirate ship is done by shouting, with the loudest faction winning regardless of what might be the morale or practical choice. The bloodthirsty portion of the crew wants to kill everyone because dead men tell no tales and can't identify the pirate ship to authorities. But the practical portion points out that killing everyone means the crew gets a reputation for not giving quarter, which means future merchant vessels will fight to the death instead of surrendering, which means more pirates die in battles. The compromise reached is that the merchant captain and officers are killed because they're the ones who can identify the pirate ship, testify in court, while the common sailors are given the choice of joining the pirate crew or being set adrift in a longboat with no supplies and a slim chance of reaching land before they die of thirst or exposure or shark attacks. You watch as the merchant captain is brought forward, a man in his 50s with gray hair and a dignity that remains intact despite his obvious terror. And the pirate quartermaster shoots him in the head with a pistol at point-blank range. The man's brains decorating the deck in a pattern that will haunt your dreams for the rest of your life, which admittedly might not be very long given your current infection situation. The other officers are dispatched with similar efficiency, no ceremony, no last words. Just the crack of pistol fire and the thud of bodies hitting the deck. And then the bodies are thrown overboard, where they sink immediately because the pockets of their fine coats are filled with the silver coins they tried to hide from the pirates. Of the 25 merchant sailors, 15 choose to join the pirate crew because the alternative is certain death in a longboat. And 10 choose the longboat because they have families waiting for them and would rather die trying to get home than live as pirates. You understand both choices, and you hate that you understand both choices. And you hate even more that you're now part of a crew that just committed murder in the most casual way possible, as if killing a man was no more significant than swatting a mosquito. The pirate ship sets course for Tortuga, which is less a proper port and more a lawless hellhole where pirates, smugglers, prostitutes, and every other form of human refuse gather to drink themselves into oblivion and spend their ill-gotten gains on pleasures that would make a medieval plague pit seem hygienic by comparison. The voyage to Tortuga takes 3 days, and during those 3 days, your thumb goes from infected to catastrophically infected. The red streaks now reaching your elbow, your hand swollen to the point where you can't make a fist, and a fever setting in that makes you alternate between chills so violent your teeth chatter and sweats so profuse you wake up lying in a puddle of your own fluids. The ship's doctor, and I use that term in the loosest possible sense, is a man named Cornelius who learned surgery by watching other people do surgery badly. And his medical kit consists of a saw, a knife, a needle, and thread, and several bottles of rum that serve as both anesthetic and antiseptic, despite being effective as neither. Cornelius takes one look at your hand and announces that the thumb needs to come off immediately, or you'll be dead within 2 days. And before you can process this information, 4 pirates have grabbed you and held you down on a table in the captain's cabin, while Cornelius takes a leather strap and ties it around your wrist as a tourniquet, cutting off blood flow to your hand and causing a new kind of pain that makes the infected thumb seem like a minor inconvenience. He pours rum over your hand, which burns so intensely that you scream and try to pull away. But the 4 men holding you are stronger than you, and they've done this before. And they know exactly how much force is required to keep a man still while pieces of him are removed. Cornelius gives you the leather strap to bite down on, and then he takes his knife which has been heated in a candle flame for sterilization, although you're pretty sure the candle flame is doing more harm than good, given the amount of soot on the blade, and he cuts into your thumb at the joint. And the pain is so beyond anything you've experienced that your vision goes white and you nearly pass out. But passing out would be a mercy. And apparently mercy is not something the universe is offering today. The cutting takes 30 seconds that feel like 30 years. The sound of the knife sawing through flesh and tendon, creating noises that will echo in your nightmares forever. And then Cornelius is holding your severed thumb in his hand like it's a trophy. And he's dunking the stump of your thumb into boiling tar to cauterize it. And the smell of your own flesh burning is the last thing you remember before you finally, mercifully, pass out from the pain and the shock and the sheer horror of watching a piece of yourself being removed by a drunk man with a dirty knife in a room that smells like death and desperation. You wake up 3 hours later to discover that you're missing a thumb. Your hand is wrapped in bandages that are already soaking through with blood and tar. And the ship has anchored in Tortuga Harbor, which means the crew is preparing to go ashore and spend their shares of the plunder on activities that will definitely involve alcohol and probably involve diseases that won't be properly classified for another century. You're given a tot of rum as payment for your suffering, which is approximately 1 ounce of liquid that tastes like it was filtered through a dead cat. And you're told that you're lucky to be alive and should be grateful that Cornelius only took the thumb and not the whole hand. As if this is some kind of achievement worth celebrating rather than the bare minimum of surgical competence. Your share of the plunder from the merchant ship is calculated by the quartermaster, who has a ledger that tracks every man's contribution to the battle and assigns shares accordingly. And your share comes to exactly 3 Spanish silver coins, which is worth approximately enough to buy 2 bottles of rum and a meal at one of Tortuga's fine dining establishments. And by fine dining, I mean a place where the rats are only slightly larger than the portions, and the chances of food poisoning are merely high rather than guaranteed. You're given shore leave along with the rest of the crew, and you follow them down the gangplank onto the dock, where the smell of Tortuga hits you like a physical assault. It's Port Royal multiplied by 10. A combination of human waste, rotting fish, vomit, spilled alcohol, and a particularly pungent smell that you eventually identify as the result of thousands of people living in close quarters with no sanitation system and a complete disregard for basic hygiene. The streets of Tortuga are unpaved mud, churned into a soup by thousands of feet. And walking through it means getting filth up to your ankles. Filth that contains substances you desperately don't want to identify. The buildings are ramshackle structures that look like they were built by drunk men using salvaged ship parts, which is exactly what happened. And they lean at angles that suggest they're one strong wind away from collapse. You follow your shipmates to a tavern called the Drowned Rat, which is truth in advertising because there are definitely drowned rats floating in the standing water that covers portions of the floor. And the proprietor is a woman who might be 40 or might be 70. It's impossible to tell through the accumulated grime. And she's serving alcohol from barrels that are covered in a layer of mold thick enough to scrape off with a knife. The rum at the Drowned Rat costs 1 silver coin per bottle, which means your entire share of plunder will buy you exactly 3 bottles of alcohol that's probably going to blind you or kill you or both. But you buy them anyway, because what else are you going to do with 3 silver coins in a place where the only commodities are vice and misery? The first bottle goes down faster than you intended, the alcohol burning your throat and hitting your empty stomach like a bomb made of fermented regret. And within 20 minutes, you're drunk enough that the pain in your hand becomes a distant throb rather than a screaming agony, which is the entire point of the exercise. Around you, your shipmates are engaged in various activities that range from merely disgusting to actively criminal. Some are gambling with dice that are obviously weighted. Some are fighting over perceived insults that probably weren't actually insults. But alcohol makes everyone a literary critic. Some are negotiating with prostitutes whose visible diseases make you understand why the average pirate lifespan is measured in months rather than years. And some are simply passed out in pools of their own vomit, having achieved their goal of complete unconsciousness with admirable efficiency. You're on your second bottle when a fight breaks out between two pirates over a woman who has made it clear she's not interested in either of them. But men who've been at sea for 6 months don't take rejection well. And soon the entire tavern erupts into a brawl that involves broken bottles, chairs used as weapons, knives appearing from hidden sheaths, and the kind of violence that happens when 70 drunk men with unresolved trauma and no impulse control occupy the same space. You try to stay out of the fight, but someone mistakes you for someone else and punches you in the face, breaking your nose with a crack you can hear over the general chaos, and blood immediately pours down your face in a hot stream that tastes of copper and defeat. You punch back reflexively, your fist connecting with something soft that might be a face or might be a stomach. You're too drunk to tell, and then you're on the ground being kicked by someone who's using your ribs as percussion instruments to play the song of their people, which is apparently titled, "Let's Kill This Guy for No Particular Reason." The tavern keeper eventually restores order by firing a musket into the ceiling, which causes a portion of the roof to collapse and nearly kills 3 people, but does succeed in making everyone stop fighting long enough to remember why they came here, which was to drink themselves into oblivion, not to die in a brawl over nothing in a tavern named after a deceased rodent. You wake up the next morning in an alley behind the drowned rat with no memory of how you got there. No money because someone stole your remaining silver coins while you were unconscious. A broken nose that's swollen to twice its normal size and makes breathing through your nostrils impossible. Your hand still throbbing from the missing thumb. And a hangover that feels like someone's using your brain as an anvil for very aggressive blacksmithing. The sun is already high in the sky, which means it's probably noon, which means you've been unconscious in an alley for approximately 12 hours, which means you've missed the ship's departure, because of course the ship left at dawn, and nobody bothered to wake you because pirates operate on a strict policy of every man for himself, and if you're too drunk or too injured to make it back to the ship on time, that's your problem. You stagger to your feet, which takes 3 attempts because your sense of balance has apparently filed for divorce from your body. And you make your way to the dock where you can see that the ship you arrived on is indeed gone, vanished over the horizon, along with your hammock, your few possessions, and any chance you had of survival that didn't involve finding another pirate crew willing to take on a one-thumbed, broken-nosed, hungover disaster of a human being. You spend the rest of the day wandering Tortuga in a daze, watching other crews prepare to sail, approaching captains to ask for a berth and being rejected because you look like death warmed over and nobody wants a crew member who can't even make it back to his own ship on time. As evening approaches, you're sitting on the dock contemplating whether drowning yourself would be less painful than whatever slow death awaits you in Tortuga when a quartermaster from a ship called the Devil's Fortune approaches and asks if you're looking for a berth. You say yes with the kind of desperate enthusiasm that makes it clear you have no other options. And he explains that the Devil's Fortune lost 6 men in their last engagement and needs replacements. And he's willing to overlook your missing thumb and broken nose if you're willing to sign articles immediately. You sign without reading the articles because you can't read anyway. And also because the alternative is starvation in a port where life is cheaper than rum. And rum is very cheap indeed. You board the Devil's Fortune that evening, and you discover that this ship makes your previous ship look like a luxury yacht by comparison. It's smaller, it's in worse repair. The captain is a known sadist who reportedly marooned his last quartermaster for suggesting they avoid naval patrols. And the crew is composed of men who couldn't get berths on better ships, which is saying something when you consider that pirate ships are already the bottom of the maritime employment barrel. Your first night aboard the Devil's Fortune confirms your worst suspicions. This ship is a floating coffin that happens to have sails attached, and everyone aboard knows they're probably going to die within the next 6 months. But has made peace with this fact through a combination of alcohol, fatalism, and the kind of dark humor that only develops when you've completely given up on the concept of a future. The berth deck is even more crowded than your previous ship, despite having fewer crew members, because the ship itself is smaller. And the smell has achieved a level of concentrated horror that suggests the accumulated filth has achieved sentience and is actively plotting against the crew. Your hammock, which you're sharing with 2 other men on rotating shifts, has a hole in it large enough to put your fist through, which means you spend the night partially suspended and partially on the deck, which is covered in the usual mixture of substances that would make a medieval plague doctor resign in protest. The crew includes several men who are clearly dying from various tropical diseases. One man has yellow fever and spends his nights shivering and hallucinating while his skin turns the color of a lemon. Another has what's probably tuberculosis and coughs up blood with such regularity that there's a bucket next to his hammock specifically for this purpose. And a third has some kind of skin condition that makes him look like he's molting like a snake, his skin coming off in sheets that he absent-mindedly picks at while talking about the weather. Nobody quarantines these men because quarantine would require having somewhere to quarantine them to, and the ship is too small to isolate anyone, so everyone just accepts that they're probably going to catch whatever diseases are currently circulating, and adds it to the list of things that might kill them. A list that already includes naval patrols, rival pirates, storms, scurvy, gangrene, drowning, falling from the rigging, cannonballs, musket fire, cutlass wounds, infected splinters, food poisoning, and the always popular death by stupidity. You're assigned to the morning watch, which starts at 4 in the morning and involves standing on deck scanning the horizon for potential prizes or threats while trying not to fall asleep. Because falling asleep on watch is punishable by flogging. And flogging on this ship is administered by the bosun, a man who takes genuine pleasure in his work and has a cat o' nine tails that he's named Mercy, with the kind of irony that makes you understand why some philosophers believe humans are fundamentally evil. The Devil's Fortune's first prize hunt under your service happens within 48 hours of leaving Tortuga, and it goes catastrophically wrong in ways that make your previous boarding experience look like a well-orchestrated military operation conducted by competent professionals. The target is what appears to be a lightly armed merchant brig, but appearances are deceiving because the merchant brig is actually a disguised naval frigate running a false flag operation. specifically designed to lure in pirates and capture them for the bounties that various governments are offering for pirate heads. And by heads I mean they literally want the heads, severed and preserved in barrels of brine, to be presented as proof of death. The realization that this is a trap comes about 30 seconds after the Devil's Fortune fires its first cannon volley, when the merchant brig suddenly deploys British naval colors and unleashes a broadside from cannons that are significantly larger than anything the pirate ship has. Cannons that punch through the Devil's Fortune's hull like it's made of wet paper rather than oak planking. The first cannonball that hits the ship kills 3 men instantly, passing through all 3 of them in sequence like a bowling ball through pins made of meat and bone. Their bodies torn apart so completely that it's impossible to tell where one man ended and the next began. You're on the gun deck, loading cannons, when a second cannonball punches through the hull 3 feet from your position, showering you with splinters the size of knives, one of which embeds itself in your shoulder deep enough that you can feel it scraping against bone. The pain is immediate and all-consuming. But there's no time to deal with it because the captain is screaming orders to return fire. And if you don't keep loading the cannons, you'll be shot for cowardice. So you keep working with a 6-inch splinter sticking out of your shoulder while blood runs down your arm and drips onto the deck. The battle lasts 20 minutes, and in that 20 minutes, the Devil's Fortune loses 18 men, which is a third of the crew, and sustains damage that would take weeks to properly repair if anyone had weeks to spare, which they don't because the naval frigate is preparing to board and capture everyone for trial and hanging. The captain makes the only rational decision available and orders full retreat, which requires throwing cargo overboard to lighten the ship, cutting away damaged rigging that's slowing the vessel, and pushing the remaining crew to their absolute limits to squeeze every possible knot of speed from a ship that's actively sinking. The Devil's Fortune manages to escape the naval frigate by sailing into a reef system that the deeper draft naval vessel can't follow without running aground. And this desperate maneuver saves the crew from hanging, but costs the ship most of its remaining hull integrity, scraping the bottom so badly that water is now pouring into the bilge faster than the pumps can handle. You're immediately assigned to pumping duty because of course you are, and you descend into the bilge with your shoulder wound still untreated. The 6-inch splinter still embedded in your flesh because nobody has time to remove it when the ship is actively sinking. The bilge water is already 3 feet deep and rising, and your job is to work the pump for as long as physically possible, while the carpenter and his mates try to patch the worst of the hull damage with whatever materials are available, which turns out to be pieces of sail canvas coated in tar and nailed over the holes, a repair method that's only slightly more effective than trying to stop a hemorrhage with a Band-Aid. You pump for 6 hours straight, your good arm screaming in agony, your wounded arm barely functional, the splinter in your shoulder grinding against bone with every movement. And the water level doesn't drop. It just stops rising quite as fast, which is considered a victory under the circumstances. The ship limps to a small, uninhabited island that the captain knows from previous voyages, and the crew spends the next week careening the vessel and attempting repairs that would make a proper shipwright weep at the sheer incompetence on display. During this week, your shoulder wound becomes infected because of course it does. The infection spreading from the splinter site outward until your entire shoulder is swollen and hot to the touch and radiating pain that makes your missing thumb seem like a pleasant memory. The ship's doctor, who is somehow even less qualified than Cornelius on your previous ship, announces that the splinter needs to come out and he's going to do it right now, without any anesthetic because the rum supply is reserved for drinking and can't be wasted on medical procedures. He has you held down by 3 men, and he digs into your shoulder with a pair of pliers that are normally used for pulling nails from wood. And he roots around in your flesh for what feels like an eternity, causing pain so intense that you lose consciousness halfway through the procedure, which is probably the only mercy you've received since becoming a pirate. When you regain consciousness after the splinter removal, you discover that the doctor has sewn up your shoulder with thread that appears to be made from unraveled rope, using stitches so large and irregularly spaced that your skin looks like it was repaired by someone who learned surgery from watching a drunk person sew a button back onto a shirt. The wound is packed with some kind of poultice that the doctor claims will prevent infection, but smells like he scraped it off the bottom of a pond and mixed it with his own optimism. And you're fairly certain that whatever's in this poultice is going to cause more problems than it solves. You're given 1 day to recover, which means lying in the berth deck surrounded by the usual sights, sounds, and smells while your shoulder throbs and oozes through the bandages. And then you're back to work because the ship needs every able-bodied man. And you're close enough to able-bodied if you don't count the missing thumb, the broken nose that never set properly and now makes you look like you lost a fight with a brick wall, and the shoulder wound that's probably going to leave you with permanent nerve damage. The repairs to the ship are completed after a week of constant work, and the Devil's Fortune sets sail again, this time heading for the coast of Hispaniola, where the captain claims to know of a Spanish treasure convoy that's poorly defended, which is exactly what he said about the last prize that turned out to be a naval trap. But nobody mentions this because the captain is the kind of man who responds to criticism by shooting people and throwing their bodies overboard. The voyage to Hispaniola takes 10 days, and during those 10 days, you begin to understand the full scope of how short your life as a pirate is likely to be. You're 19 years old, which makes you one of the younger crew members, and you've been a pirate for exactly 3 months. And in those 3 months, you've lost a thumb, broken your nose, sustained a shoulder wound that's definitely infected despite the doctor's poultice, developed scurvy symptoms including bleeding gums and loosening teeth, and been exposed to enough tropical diseases that you're probably incubating at least 3 separate illnesses that will manifest over the coming weeks. You look at the older pirates, the men in their 30s and 40s who have survived longer than average, and you realize they all bear the marks of their profession. Missing limbs, scars covering every visible inch of skin, chronic coughs that suggest tuberculosis, the yellowed eyes of liver disease from constant alcohol consumption, and a haunted look that comes from years of witnessing and committing acts of violence that would make most people lose their faith in humanity. You understand, with the kind of clarity that only comes from proximity to death, that you're not going to live long enough to become one of these scarred veterans, that you're probably going to die within the next year from disease or battle or simple bad luck. And this understanding should terrify you, but instead it just makes you numb, because terror requires the energy to care about the future, and you've run out of that energy somewhere between the bilge pumping and the amateur surgery, and the constant realization that every day alive is a day borrowed against odds that are steadily increasing against you. The Spanish treasure convoy turns out to be real, which is somehow more terrifying than if it had been another trap. Because real treasure means real fighting, And real fighting means watching men die in ways that Hollywood never shows, because audiences would walk out of theaters if they saw what actually happens when a cannonball hits a human body at close range. The convoy consists of 3 ships, 2 heavily armed galleons escorting a smaller merchant vessel that's presumably carrying the actual treasure. And the Devil's Fortune strategy, if you can call it a strategy, is to separate the merchant vessel from its escorts and overwhelm it with boarding parties before the galleons can come to its rescue. This plan has approximately 15 different ways it can go catastrophically wrong. And over the next 3 hours, you witnessed 12 of those ways manifest in real time. The initial attack goes well enough, with the Devil's Fortune managing to get between the merchant vessel and one of the galleons, creating a temporary window where the merchant ship is vulnerable. But vulnerable is a relative term when the ship in question still has 40 crew members armed with muskets, pistols, cutlasses, and the kind of desperate courage that comes from knowing that surrender to pirates means being robbed and possibly killed anyway. You're part of the second boarding party, which means you get to watch the first boarding party attempt to cross to the merchant vessel via grappling hooks and boarding planks. And you get to watch as the Spanish crew repels this first wave with brutal efficiency, shooting men as they try to cross, cutting the ropes of grappling hooks so that pirates fall into the ocean between the 2 ships where they're crushed as the vessels collide and separate with the rhythm of the waves, and throwing barrels of burning pitch onto the Devil's Fortune's deck, which sets the forward mast on fire and creates a whole new emergency that requires men to abandon the boarding attempt to fight the fire before it spreads to the powder magazine and turns the entire ship into an expanding ball of wooden shrapnel and dismembered pirates. You're handed a cutlass, which is essentially a heavy curved sword designed for chopping rather than stabbing. And you're pushed toward a boarding plank that's slick with blood from the first wave. And you're crossing this plank while men are shooting at you from 15 feet away, which is close enough that even the notoriously inaccurate muskets of this era can hit a human-sized target with distressing frequency. You make it across somehow, your feet slipping twice on the blood-slick plank, your heart pounding so hard you can hear it over the screams and gunfire. And you land on the merchant vessel's deck, where chaos has achieved its final form and transcended into something beyond mere violence and entered the realm of pure existential horror. The deck of the merchant vessel is a slaughterhouse, and I use that term literally because the amount of blood covering the wooden planks has created a surface so slippery that men on both sides are falling down as they try to fight, which would be comedic if it wasn't resulting in people being trampled to death or stabbed while prone, or simply sliding across the deck and over the railing into the ocean where they drown. Because swimming in full clothing while wounded is not a skill anyone possesses. You're immediately engaged by a Spanish sailor who's wielding a boarding pike, which is a spear-like weapon with a wicked curved blade designed to hook into rigging but equally effective at disemboweling humans. And he's thrusting this pike at your midsection with the kind of enthusiasm that suggests he really doesn't want you on his ship. You parry with your cutlass, which you've held for approximately 2 minutes total, and have no idea how to actually use beyond swing it at the other guy and hope for the best. And your parry is so clumsy that the pike blade cuts through your shirt and opens a gash across your ribs that's not deep enough to kill you, but certainly deep enough to add another injury to your growing collection of reasons you should have stayed in whatever port you originally left from. You swing your cutlass in a wild arc that has more panic than technique. and by sheer luck or divine intervention or cosmic irony, the blade connects with the Spanish sailor's neck with enough force to partially decapitate him, and he drops to the deck while blood fountains from his severed arteries in rhythmic spurts that match his dying heartbeat. And you stand there frozen in shock because you've just killed a man, actually killed him with your own hands. And the reality of this act is so overwhelming that you nearly vomit until someone crashes into you from behind and knocks you forward into the expanding pool of blood from the man you just killed. The battle continues around you with a kind of savage intensity that suggests both sides have forgotten why they're fighting and are now operating on pure adrenaline and survival instinct. And you're crawling across the blood-slicked deck, trying to retrieve your dropped cutlass while boots stomp around you and men scream and die in a symphony of violence that will echo in your nightmares for whatever remains of your life. You manage to grab your cutlass and get to your feet just in time to see the Spanish captain emerge from his cabin with a brace of pistols and start shooting pirates with the methodical efficiency of a man who's been in more boarding actions than he can count. Each shot dropping a pirate to the deck with wounds that are immediately fatal or close enough that it makes no difference. The Spanish captain's intervention turns the tide of the battle in ways that make it clear the pirates are going to lose this boarding action. And the call goes up to retreat back to the Devil's Fortune, which is easier said than done when you're surrounded by enemy combatants, and the boarding planks are now actively being cut away by Spanish sailors who have decided that trapping pirates on their deck and killing them all is preferable to letting any escape. You fight your way back toward the railing, your cutlass work improving slightly through the accelerated learning process of do it right or die immediately. And you manage to cut down one more Spanish sailor, this time with a thrust to the stomach that goes in easier than you expected and comes out harder. The blade catching on something internal that might be ribs or spine. And the sailor's face as he dies shows not anger or fear, but a kind of surprised disappointment, like he can't quite believe this is how his story ends. Killed by a one-thumbed pirate who barely knows which end of a sword to hold. You reach the railing to find that all the boarding planks have been cut away, which means the only way back to the Devil's Fortune is to jump the gap between the ships, a gap that's currently about 8 feet wide and fluctuating as the vessels rise and fall with the ocean swells. And 8 feet doesn't sound like much until you're looking at it while people are trying to kill you, and you realize that missing this jump means falling into the water between two multi-ton vessels that will crush you like a grape when they inevitably collide. You jump anyway because the alternative is staying on the merchant vessel and dying with absolute certainty. And you make it across, but barely. Your fingers catching the railing of the Devil's Fortune while your legs dangle over the churning water below. And for 3 terrifying seconds you hang there while your wounded shoulder screams in protest and your one remaining thumb does the work of 2. And then hands are grabbing you and pulling you up and over. And you collapse onto the deck of the Devil's Fortune, breathing so hard you think your lungs might burst. The Devil's Fortune immediately cuts the grappling lines and falls away from the merchant vessel, the pirate crew having abandoned approximately 20 men on the Spanish ship, men who are now being systematically killed or captured. And you can hear their screams, even over the general chaos and the sound of the Spanish galleons finally arriving to join the fight with their significantly larger cannons that start punching holes in the Devil's Fortune's hull with disturbing accuracy. The Spanish galleons pursue the Devil's Fortune for 6 hours, and during those 6 hours, the pirate ship sustains damage that makes the previous encounter with the naval frigate look like a minor fender bender in a parking lot. Cannonballs tear through the rigging, bringing down the mizzen mast in a catastrophic collapse that kills 5 men who were in the wrong place at the wrong time. The massive wooden pole falling with enough force to crush them flat and pin their bodies to the deck in a grotesque display that requires the carpenter to saw through the mast to retrieve what's left of the corpses for burial at sea. The hull takes multiple hits below the waterline, which means more pumping duty for you and everyone else who isn't actively sailing the ship or returning fire with the Devil's Fortune's pathetically inadequate cannons. And you spend 3 of those 6 hours in the bilge working the pump while water pours in through holes faster than you can pump it out, creating a rising tide that suggests the ship is going to sink long before the Spanish give up the chase. Your new rib wound opens up from the physical exertion of pumping, blood soaking through your already destroyed shirt and mixing with the bilge water in a combination that guarantees infection. And your shoulder wound from the splinter removal chooses this moment to start bleeding again. The crude rope stitches pulling apart under the strain, and you're working the pump with blood running down both your torso and your arm, while the ship groans and shudders around you with each impact of Spanish cannon fire. The Devil's Fortune finally escapes by sailing into a fog bank that rolls in with the kind of convenient timing that would seem contrived in fiction, but occasionally happens in reality. And the Spanish galleons lose sight of the pirate ship and eventually give up the pursuit because chasing pirates into fog where they might have set an ambush is not worth the risk when they've already killed or captured 20 pirates and inflicted crippling damage on the surviving ship. The fog bank also brings a tropical storm, because of course it does. Because one threat at a time would be too merciful. And the next 12 hours are spent riding out waves that are 20 feet tall, waves that throw the ship around like a toy in a bathtub being played with by a violent child. Waves that send everything not tied down, sliding across the deck and over the railings into the ocean, including 2 men who lose their grip during a particularly violent roll and disappear into the darkness and churning water with screams that are cut short by either drowning or impact with debris. The storm eventually passes, leaving the Devil's Fortune wallowing in the ocean's swells like a drunk person trying to stand up after being knocked down repeatedly. And the damage assessment reveals that the ship is barely seaworthy, having lost the mizzenmast, sustained multiple hull breaches that are temporarily patched with canvas and prayers, lost most of the spare rigging and sails, and suffered casualties that bring the crew down to 38 men from the original 70 who left Tortuga, which means the ship is now dangerously undermanned for any kind of engagement and barely has enough crew to sail properly. The captain calls a council, which is the pirate version of a democratic meeting where everyone gets to voice their opinion before the captain does whatever he was going to do anyway. And the consensus is that the Devil's Fortune needs to find a safe harbor for major repairs, and the crew needs to replenish their numbers by either recruiting new pirates or press-ganging unfortunate souls from ports and captured vessels. The nearest safe harbor is a pirate haven called Nassau in the Bahamas, which is essentially Tortuga's even more lawless cousin, a place where the concept of government exists only in the theoretical sense, and the primary law is enforced by whoever has the most guns at any given moment. The voyage to Nassau takes 8 days because the ship can barely make headway with its damaged rigging and missing mast. And during those 8 days, you have time to contemplate the full scope of your situation. You're 19 years old. You've been a pirate for 4 months. You've killed 2 men with your own hands. You're missing a thumb. You have a broken nose that makes you look like a failed boxer. You have a rib wound that's infected and weeping pus. You have a shoulder wound that's also infected and showing red streaks that suggest blood poisoning is making a comeback tour. You have scurvy symptoms that include bleeding gums and teeth that are starting to loosen in their sockets. And you're on a ship that's one storm away from sinking with a crew that's been reduced by nearly half, and a captain who just led you into a disastrous engagement that accomplished nothing except getting 32 men killed or captured for absolutely no gain whatsoever. You should be planning your escape, figuring out how to jump ship at Nassau and find legitimate work or book passage back to whatever port you originally came from. But the problem is that you're marked now, visibly marked as a pirate by your injuries and your lack of a thumb and the general aura of violence and desperation that clings to you like the smell of the bilge. And legitimate society doesn't want marked pirates. They want to hang them from gibbets at the harbor entrance as a warning to others. Nassau turns out to be everything you feared and nothing you hoped for. A port where approximately 3,000 pirates, smugglers, prostitutes, and wanted criminals have created a society that functions on principles that would make anarchist philosophers weep at the beautiful chaos, and everyone else runs screaming for the nearest legitimate government. The harbor is so crowded with pirate ships that they're anchored 3 and 4 deep, creating a floating city of wooden vessels in various states of repair and decay. And getting to shore requires navigating between these ships in a small boat while trying not to get crushed when the tide shifts and the vessels swing on their anchor chains. You make it to shore and immediately understand that Nassau makes Tortuga look civilized by comparison. There are no actual streets, just paths trampled through the sand and mud by thousands of feet. No buildings that would pass any kind of structural inspection, just lean-tos and shacks constructed from salvaged ship parts and palm fronds. No sanitation system at all, just people relieving themselves wherever they happen to be standing when nature calls, which creates a pervasive smell that suggests the entire settlement is built on a foundation of human waste mixed with spilled alcohol and rotting fish. The Devil's Fortune's crew immediately disperses to find alcohol, women, and trouble, not necessarily in that order. And you're left to wander the settlement with your injuries throbbing and your fever climbing and your general sense of impending death reaching new heights of certainty. You find a tavern that's advertising itself as having a surgeon available, which turns out to be another drunk charlatan with a knife and delusions of medical competence. But you're desperate enough to let him examine your wounds. He takes one look at your infected rib wound and infected shoulder wound and announces that you need to have the infections drained immediately. And before you can ask about anesthetic, he's heating a knife in a candle flame and explaining that he's going to cut open both infections and let the pus drain out. And this is going to hurt significantly, but the alternative is dying from blood poisoning within a week. So you should probably bite down on this leather strap and try not to scream too loudly because it disturbs the other customers. The procedure is exactly as horrific as advertised. He cuts into your rib wound and releases a flow of pus that smells so bad you gag, even while biting down on the leather strap. And then he does the same to your shoulder wound. And the pain is so intense that your vision goes white around the edges, and you can feel yourself starting to pass out. But he slaps you across the face and tells you to stay conscious because if you pass out now, you might not wake up, which is the kind of medical advice that really inspires confidence. You survive the drainage procedure, which is less of an achievement and more of a failure of the universe to put you out of your misery. And you spend the next 3 days lying in a hammock in a boarding house that rents sleeping space by the hour to pirates who are too drunk or too injured to make it back to their ships. The boarding house is exactly as pleasant as you'd imagine a place that caters to wounded pirates would be. The hammocks are communal and used by multiple people per day, without washing. The floor is covered in a layer of filth that's probably several years old, and has achieved a kind of geological stratification where you can see different eras of human degradation in the various layers. And the other occupants include men dying from yellow fever, men recovering from knife fights, men who are simply drunk and decided this was a good place to pass out, and one man who's been dead for approximately 2 days, but nobody's bothered to remove the body because that would require effort, and everyone in Nassau operates on a strict policy of minimum viable effort for everything. Your fever breaks on the 2nd day, which the tavern surgeon takes credit for despite having done nothing except drain the infections and tell you to drink rum because it's medicinal. And by the 3rd day, you're well enough to sit up and take inventory of your situation, which is grim in ways that would make a funeral director suggest maybe looking on the bright side. You have no money because your share of the plunder was spent on the infection drainage. You're on a ship that's barely seaworthy with a crew that's been decimated and a captain who's proven to be spectacularly incompetent at the entire business of piracy. You have injuries that are healing but will leave permanent scars and limitations. And you're in a port where the only employment opportunities involve either joining another pirate crew and continuing this nightmare, or finding work as a tavern keeper or prostitute, which are apparently the only other viable careers in Nassau's economy. You're contemplating these depressing options when a man enters the boarding house and announces that he's recruiting for a new crew, that they're planning to go after a Spanish treasure fleet that's due to pass through the Straits of Florida in 2 weeks, and that they're offering full shares to any man willing to sign articles immediately. And despite everything you've experienced, despite the pain and the suffering and the constant proximity to death, you find yourself standing up and walking toward this recruiter because the alternative is staying in Nassau and slowly starving to death or dying from the next wave of yellow fever that sweeps through the settlement. And at least on a pirate ship, you're doing something, even if that something is probably going to get you killed. The new ship is called the Revenge, which should be a red flag given that ships named after emotions tend to have crews that are acting out unresolved trauma rather than engaging in rational economic piracy. But beggars can't be choosers, and you're definitely a beggar at this point in your career. The Revenge is larger than the Devil's Fortune, which is good, and it's in better repair, which is also good. But it's captained by a man named Edward, who has a reputation for being brilliantly successful at piracy and also completely insane, which is less good and more of a significant concern that you're choosing to ignore, because you need to eat, and eating requires being on a ship that occasionally captures prizes. Edward addresses the new recruits on the deck of the Revenge, and he's exactly what you'd expect from a man with a reputation for insanity. He's wearing a long coat that was probably expensive when it was new, but is now stained with substances you'd rather not identify. He has 4 pistols tucked into a sash across his chest. His beard is braided with slow-burning fuses that he lights during battle to create a demonic appearance. And his eyes have the kind of manic gleam that suggests he's either a genius or completely detached from reality, or possibly both. He explains that the Spanish treasure fleet they're going after is carrying approximately 2 million pieces of 8, which is an amount of money so large that your share would set you up for life, assuming you survive to collect it and don't die in the attempt. And he outlines a plan that's either brilliantly innovative or suicidally reckless, depending on how you look at it. The plan involves the Revenge sailing in formation with 2 other pirate ships, creating a small fleet that can overwhelm the treasure fleet's escorts through coordinated attacks. And Edward explains this plan with such confidence and charisma that you actually find yourself believing it might work, which shows how desperate you are for something to work out in your favor for once. You sign the articles, which include provisions about shares and conduct and discipline that are standard for pirate ships, except the Revenge's articles also include a clause that states anyone who shows cowardice in battle will be shot immediately by the captain, and another clause that states anyone who steals from the common plunder will be marooned with no supplies, and a third clause that states anyone who questions the captain's decisions will be flogged with 100 lashes, which is generally enough to kill a man or at least wish he was dead. The voyage to intercept the Spanish treasure fleet takes 12 days. And during those 12 days, you learn that the Revenge, despite being better maintained than the Devil's Fortune, is still a pirate ship, and therefore still a floating nightmare of disease, violence, and casual brutality. The crew of 90 men includes representatives from every nationality that has a coastline and a tradition of maritime lawlessness. English pirates fleeing debtor's prison, French pirates who were expelled from their naval service for crimes too severe even for the French Navy, Spanish pirates who turned against their own country for reasons ranging from political disagreement to simple greed, African pirates who escaped from slavery and decided that turnabout was fair play, and a handful of pirates whose origins are so mysterious that asking about them is considered impolite, which on a pirate ship is saying something given that politeness is generally not a valued commodity. Your bunkmate is a man named Thomas, who tells you that he's been sailing with Captain Edward for 3 years, which makes him ancient by pirate standards, and he's missing his left ear and 3 fingers from his right hand, and has a scar across his face that suggests someone tried to split his head open and nearly succeeded. Thomas explains the ship's culture, which involves a complex hierarchy based on experience, fighting ability, and the captain's favor. And he warns you that the Revenge operates differently from other pirate ships because Edward demands absolute loyalty and punishes disloyalty with creative and horrifying methods that make standard flogging seem merciful by comparison. You ask Thomas why he stays if the captain is so brutal, and Thomas laughs and explains that Edward is brutal to enemies and the disloyal but generous to his crew. That men who sail with Edward get richer than pirates on other ships because Edward takes bigger risks and succeeds more often. And that the fear of Edward's punishment keeps order in ways that prevent the kind of internal crew conflicts that sink other pirate ventures. This explanation makes a certain twisted sense, and you're pondering the ethics of trading freedom for security and potential wealth when the lookout shouts that he's spotted the Spanish treasure fleet on the horizon. And suddenly, the theoretical discussion of piracy becomes very practical and very immediate as the crew scrambles to battle stations and Captain Edward emerges from his cabin with his beard fuses already lit, creating streams of smoke that make him look like a demon rising from hell to claim his due. The Spanish treasure fleet consists of 6 ships, 3 large galleons carrying the actual treasure, and 3 smaller frigates serving as escorts. And the pirate fleet of 3 ships is mathematically outgunned and outmanned. But Captain Edward has a plan that relies on speed, surprise, and the willingness to engage in levels of violence that make regular naval engagements look like gentlemanly disputes conducted according to established rules of civilized warfare. The plan is for the 3 pirate ships to attack at dawn when visibility is low, to focus all firepower on one of the escort frigates and sink or disable it quickly. Then use the resulting chaos to board one of the treasure galleons before the other escorts can respond. Grab as much treasure as the crews can carry in 15 minutes, and then retreat before the superior Spanish forces can organize an effective counterattack. It's a plan that requires perfect timing, perfect execution, and perfect luck. 3 things that have been notably absent from your pirate career so far. But Edward sells it with such conviction that the crew actually believes they can pull it off. And you want to believe it too, because the alternative is accepting that you're about to die in a suicidal attack on a heavily defended convoy for a treasure you'll never live to spend. The Revenge and its companion ships approach the Spanish fleet through the pre-dawn darkness, sails reefed to reduce visibility, crews silent at their stations, and you're at your cannon again because apparently you've developed a reputation as someone who doesn't panic during bombardments. Which is less a compliment and more an observation that you've become numb to the constant proximity of death. The dawn attack begins with the 3 pirate ships unleashing simultaneous broadsides into the nearest escort frigate. And the concentrated fire is devastating, tearing through the Spanish ship's hull and rigging with such violence that the frigate begins listing immediately, its crew scrambling to respond, but already overwhelmed by the sudden assault. The Revenge immediately closes with one of the treasure galleons, while the other 2 pirate ships engage the remaining escorts. And Edward is on the bow, screaming orders and firing his pistols into the air, and generally looking like a madman. Which he is, but a madman who's currently succeeding at his insane plan in ways that make you question your understanding of probability and risk assessment. The boarding of the treasure galleon is chaos elevated to an art form, a masterclass in organized violence that would make military historians either applaud or vomit, depending on their tolerance for watching human beings treat each other like obstacles to be removed through the application of sharp metal objects and explosive projectiles. The Revenge grapples onto the galleon with hooks and ropes, and the boarding party swarms across like ants attacking a much larger beetle. Except these ants have cutlasses and pistols and absolutely no regard for their own safety, because they've all calculated that dying while attempting to steal treasure is preferable to living in poverty. Which is a calculation that makes perfect sense when you've experienced the kind of grinding poverty that defines pirate life between prizes. You're in the second wave of boarders, which means you get to watch the first wave engage the Spanish crew in hand-to-hand combat that makes your previous boarding experiences look like practice sessions conducted by people who are being polite about the whole killing thing. Captain Edward is leading the charge, and he's fighting with all 4 of his pistols at once, firing them in sequence as he advances across the deck, each shot dropping a Spanish sailor, and when his pistols are empty, he's wielding them as clubs, while simultaneously drawing his cutlass with his teeth in a display of multitasking that would be impressive if it wasn't so absolutely terrifying to witness. The Spanish crew is fighting back with desperate courage, because they know that pirates don't always give quarter and they're defending cargo worth 2 million pieces of 8. Which is enough money that their officers have probably threatened them with execution if they let it be taken. So they're caught between the certainty of pirate violence and the possibility of Spanish military justice, which makes them fight with the kind of desperation that makes this boarding action significantly more difficult than Edward's confident plan suggested it would be. You cross to the galleon and immediately find yourself fighting a Spanish officer who's wielding a rapier with considerably more skill than you possess with your cutlass, and he disarms you within 3 moves. Your cutlass flying across the deck and leaving you defenseless, except for a belaying pin you grab from the railing and swing at his head with all your strength, connecting with his temple with a crack that sounds like breaking pottery. And he drops to the deck unconscious or dead. You're not sure which and don't have time to check because another Spanish sailor is coming at you with a boarding axe that he's swinging with enough force to decapitate you if it connects. You dodge the boarding axe by throwing yourself flat on the deck, which saves your head, but results in you landing face first in a pool of blood from one of the earlier casualties. And the blood gets in your mouth and nose and eyes. And you're temporarily blinded while someone is trying to kill you with an axe. Which is exactly the kind of multitasking challenge that your life has become. You roll sideways blindly, hear the axe hit the deck where your head was a moment ago, and you're groping around for any kind of weapon when your hand closes on something metal that turns out to be a Spanish pistol dropped by one of the dead sailors. And you point it in the general direction of where you think the axe wielder is and pull the trigger. And either through luck or divine intervention or the universe briefly deciding to cut you a break, the pistol fires and the ball hits the Spanish sailor in the chest, and he staggers backward and falls over the railing into the ocean between the 2 ships. You wipe the blood from your eyes and manage to stand up. And you can see that the battle is turning in the pirates' favor because Captain Edward and his crew are simply more willing to engage in extreme violence than the Spanish sailors who signed up for what they thought was a relatively safe convoy duty, and are now discovering that piracy is not a theoretical concept, but a very practical reality involving people trying to kill them with enthusiasm. The pirates fight their way to the cargo hold while a rear guard keeps the remaining Spanish crew occupied. And you're part of the group that descends into the hold where the treasure is stored. And the sight that greets you makes every injury, every disease, every moment of suffering seem almost worth it. Because the hold is filled with chests of silver coins, bars of gold, religious artifacts crusted with gems, fine silks and spices, and enough wealth to set up every man on the crew for life if it's divided fairly, which it probably won't be. But even an unfair share of 2 million pieces of 8 is more money than you've ever seen or imagined. The loading process is frantic because Edward's plan called for 15 minutes, and you're already at 12 minutes. And the other Spanish escorts are finally organizing a response, and you're grabbing whatever you can carry and running it back to the Revenge, making 3 trips before Edward calls the retreat. And even in those 3 trips, you've personally carried enough treasure that your share should be substantial if you survive to collect it. The Revenge and the other 2 pirate ships disengage from the Spanish fleet, with their holds filled with treasure and their decks covered in wounded and dead. And the escape is successful only because the Spanish escorts are too busy trying to save the damaged treasure galleon to pursue immediately, giving the pirates a critical head start that they use to sail toward a series of islands where they can divide the plunder and make repairs. The voyage to these islands takes 4 days. And during those 4 days, the full cost of the treasure raid becomes apparent. The 3 pirate ships lost a combined total of 42 men killed and 63 wounded, some of whom will die from their wounds over the coming days because pirate medicine is more about amputation and prayer than actual healing. You survived the battle with only minor new injuries. A cut across your forearm from a Spanish cutlass, bruises covering most of your torso from being knocked around during the fighting, and a persistent ringing in your ears from all the pistol and cannon fire at close range that suggests You've suffered hearing damage that will be permanent. But you're alive, and you participated in what's being called the most successful pirate raid in recent Caribbean history. And your share of the treasure is calculated by the quartermaster as 120 pieces of 8+ a small gold bar, which is more money than you've ever possessed and represents approximately 5 years of wages for a legitimate sailor. Except you earned it in 4 months of piracy that included losing a thumb, breaking your nose, getting stabbed, getting infected multiple times, and killing at least 4 men with your own hands. The division of the treasure happens on a small, uninhabited island, where the 3 crews gather to split the plunder according to the articles that were signed before the raid. And Captain Edward oversees the process, with his pistols prominently displayed, to ensure that nobody tries to cheat the system. Because even among pirates who've just succeeded together, there's always the temptation to take more than your fair share. And Edward's reputation ensures that this temptation remains theoretical rather than practical. You receive your share in a small leather pouch that's heavier than you expected, and you hold it and feel the weight of the coins and gold bar. And you experience a complex mixture of emotions that includes triumph, guilt, exhaustion, and a profound sense of emptiness because you've achieved the goal that brought you into piracy in the first place. You've gotten rich, or at least wealthy by pirate standards. And now you have to decide whether this was worth everything you've sacrificed and suffered to obtain it. With treasure in hand and the pirate crews temporarily at peace, you have approximately 24 hours on this uninhabited island before the ships need to sail again. And in those 24 hours, you're forced to contemplate what comes next in a life that you never planned to survive this long. Some of the pirates are already spending their shares on rum that was brought from the ships, creating impromptu celebrations on the beach that involve drinking, gambling, and the kind of boisterous behavior that happens when desperate men suddenly have money and no immediate threats to their survival. Others are treating their wounds, and the beach becomes a temporary hospital where the ship surgeons perform their crude medical procedures with slightly better lighting than they have below decks. And you watch as 3 men have limbs amputated, 2 men have musket balls dug out of various body parts, and 1 man dies from an abdominal wound that's been slowly killing him since the battle. His death surprisingly peaceful given that he's been in agony for 4 days. You sit apart from both the celebrations and the medical procedures, and you're joined by Thomas, your bunkmate from the Revenge, who's also survived the battle with new scars to add to his collection. Thomas asks what you're planning to do with your share, and you admit you don't know. That you could take this money and book passage on a legitimate merchant vessel to any port in the world. Start a new life somewhere where nobody knows you're a pirate. Maybe open a tavern or a shop or just live quietly on your wealth until it runs out. Thomas laughs and explains that this plan has been attempted by approximately every pirate who's ever made a big score. And the success rate is nearly 0 because pirates are marked men in ways that go beyond physical scars. That legitimate society can smell the violence and desperation on you, even if you're wearing fine clothes and have a pouch full of gold. And besides, the money never lasts as long as you think it will, because you have no experience managing wealth, and you'll spend it faster than you earned it. He suggests instead that you continue sailing with Captain Edward, that 1 successful raid means more are possible, that you could accumulate enough wealth to actually retire in comfort, rather than just temporarily escaping poverty before sliding back into it. This suggestion makes a certain practical sense, but you're also aware that every additional voyage increases the probability of death or capture, and probability doesn't care about your previous successes. Each voyage is a new roll of dice loaded against you. The decision about what to do with your treasure and your life is temporarily postponed when a lookout on one of the ship spots sails on the horizon. And the celebratory atmosphere on the beach transforms immediately into organized chaos as three crews scramble to get back to their ships because sails on the horizon could be anything from merchant vessels to naval warships to rival pirates. And none of those options are particularly good when you're anchored at an island with your crew scattered on the beach drinking rum. The ships turn out to be a Royal Navy squadron consisting of 2 frigates and a ship of the line, which is essentially a floating fortress with enough cannons to reduce all 3 pirate ships to splinters. And they're heading directly for the island with clear intent to engage, which means someone informed the Navy about the treasure raid and the probable location where the pirates would go to divide the plunder, which means there's an informant among one of the 3 crews, which means the paranoid suspicion that defines pirate life has just been validated in the worst possible way. Captain Edward makes the decision to abandon the island immediately, rather than trying to fight a naval force that outguns the pirates by a factor of at least 5 to 1. And the 3 pirate ships set sail within 30 minutes of spotting the Navy squadron, leaving behind approximately 20 pirates who were too drunk to make it back to the ships in time. Men who will be captured and hanged, and whose deaths will be on the conscience of every pirate who sailed away and left them. Assuming pirates have consciences, which is debatable. The pursuit lasts for 8 hours, and during those 8 hours, you're back in the bilge pumping water because the Revenge sustained hull damage during the treasure raid that hasn't been properly repaired. And you're pumping while the ship is sailing at maximum speed, and cannonballs from the pursuing warships are occasionally hitting the water close enough to shower the deck with spray. The Revenge and one of the other pirate ships managed to escape by sailing into a reef system that the deeper draft naval vessels can't follow. But the 3rd pirate ship is caught and engaged by the Navy frigates. And you watch from the rigging as this ship is systematically destroyed. Its masts shot away, its hull holed below the waterline, its crew killed or captured. And the final image you have before the Revenge escapes into the reef system is of pirates jumping from the burning ship into the ocean, where they'll either drown or be picked up by the Navy and hanged. And you understand that this could easily have been your ship, your death, your body floating in the Caribbean or swinging from a noose at Port Royal. The Revenge limps into a hidden cove that Captain Edward knows from previous voyages, a place where the ship can be repaired and the crew can recover from the latest brush with death. And you're beginning to understand that pirate life is essentially an endless cycle of raiding, escaping, repairing, and repeating until you either die or get lucky enough to retire. And the odds of the latter are astronomical. The hidden cove is on a small island that has no permanent settlement, but shows signs of being used regularly by pirates, with crude shelters constructed from salvaged ship parts and the remains of campfires, indicating that this is a known refuge for men who need to disappear for a while. The crew spends 2 weeks in this cove, and during those 2 weeks, you have time to properly assess the physical and psychological toll that 5 months of piracy has taken on your 19-year-old body and mind. Physically, you're a wreck. Missing a thumb, broken nose permanently crooked, shoulder with limited range of motion from the improperly healed splinter wound, ribs that ache constantly from the cutlass slash that got infected, hearing damage that makes everything sound muffled, teeth loosening from scurvy despite eating better since the treasure raid, and a collection of scars that make you look like you've been in a war, which you have. Except the war is against your own survival instincts and common sense. Psychologically, you're even worse. You have nightmares every night about the men you've killed. Dreams where their faces are perfectly clear and they're asking you why you took their lives for money. And you wake up in your hammock covered in sweat and sometimes screaming. And your shipmates have stopped commenting on this because half of them have the same nightmares. The other half have moved beyond nightmares into a kind of waking trauma where they're just numb to everything. You've killed 4 men directly with your own hands and participated in raids where dozens more died from cannon fire you helped load. And you can't quite reconcile the person you were 5 months ago with the person you are now, because that person wouldn't recognize you and would probably be horrified by what you've become. Thomas finds you sitting on the beach one evening, and he explains that this feeling is normal. That every pirate goes through a period where they question whether the money is worth the cost, and that you have 2 choices. Either accept that you're a pirate, and this is what pirates do, and find a way to live with the guilt and trauma, or leave piracy and try to reintegrate into legitimate society where you'll have different problems, but at least won't be adding to your body count. The decision gets made for you when a hurricane hits the island 3 days after this conversation with Thomas. And hurricanes in the Caribbean are not the weather events you track on television with mild interest, but rather apocalyptic demonstrations of nature's power that make you understand why ancient people believed in angry gods who punished human arrogance. The hurricane builds over the course of a day, the sky darkening from blue to gray to a sickly green-black that suggests the atmosphere itself has decided to participate in your destruction. And the wind increases from a breeze to a gale, to something beyond wind, into a physical force that picks up loose objects and sends them flying like missiles designed to kill anyone stupid enough to be outside. Captain Edward orders the Revenge to be anchored with every available chain and rope, and the crew takes shelter in the crude structures on the island and in the ship itself. And then the hurricane arrives, with the kind of violence that makes your previous experiences with storms seem like gentle rain showers. The wind is so strong, it's physically painful, like being sandblasted by air, moving at speeds that make breathing difficult and standing impossible. And the rain comes down in quantities that suggest the ocean has decided to reverse its relationship with the sky and is now falling from above rather than sitting below. The Revenge is torn from its anchors within the first hour, multiple chains snapping like thread, and the ship is driven across the cove and onto the beach, where it grounds with an impact that you can feel through the earth itself, the hull cracking as it hits the sand and rocks. The crude shelters are destroyed within minutes, palm fronds and salvaged ship parts flying through the air like nature's shrapnel. And you're forced to take refuge in the ship's hold, while the hurricane tries its best to tear the vessel apart around you. The storm lasts for 18 hours. 18 hours of sustained terror where the ship groans and creaks and occasionally makes cracking sounds that suggest structural failure is imminent, where water pours through every seam and gap faster than it can be bailed, where the wind outside sounds like the screaming of 1,000 souls being tortured, and where you're certain that you're going to die, not from violence or disease, but from nature simply erasing you like you're a mistake that needs to be corrected. When the hurricane finally passes and you emerge from the hold, the island has been transformed into a wasteland. Every tree stripped of leaves or uprooted entirely. the beach reshaped by the storm surge, and the Revenge sitting at a 45-degree angle on the beach with damage so extensive that it's clearly never going to sail again. The crew of the Revenge is stranded on the island with a ship that will never sail again. Limited supplies salvaged from the wreck, and the growing realization that unless another ship happens to pass close enough to spot the survivors, you're all going to die slowly from starvation or disease or both. Captain Edward, to his credit, doesn't fall apart in the face of this disaster, but instead organizes the survivors into work parties that are tasked with salvaging everything useful from the wreck, constructing better shelters from the salvaged materials, establishing a water collection system using sails to catch rain, and creating signal fires that might attract passing vessels. Of the 53 crew members who were on the island when the hurricane hit, 47 survived, which is actually better than you expected given the violence of the storm. And these 47 men are now residents of an island that has no native food sources larger than crabs and lizards, no fresh water except what can be collected from rain, and no realistic prospect of rescue unless you get extraordinarily lucky. You're assigned to the water collection detail, which involves stretching damaged sails between trees to create catchment surfaces that funnel rainwater into barrels. And this work is made more difficult by the fact that the hurricane stripped most of the trees of their leaves, and many of them are leaning at dangerous angles that suggest they could fall at any moment. The days blend together in a routine of work, rationing, and waiting. You wake up, you check the water barrels. You eat a tiny portion of whatever food has been salvaged from the ship. You work on improving the camp or maintaining the signal fires. You eat another tiny portion of food. You try to sleep despite the discomfort and the hunger and the knowledge that every day without rescue is a day closer to starvation. Your treasure, that 120 pieces of 8 and gold bar that represented your escape from poverty, is useless on an island with no economy and no way to spend it. And you've hidden it in the wreck because even in a survival situation, pirates will steal from each other if given the opportunity, which says something profound about human nature, or at least about the particular subset of human nature that chooses piracy as a career. 2 weeks pass, then 3, then 4, and the food supplies dwindle to nothing. And the crew is surviving on crabs caught in the shallows, lizards hunted with improvised traps, and occasionally seabirds taken with rocks because nobody has powder for the muskets. And even if they did, wasting a shot on a bird would be considered criminally wasteful when the shot might be needed to signal a rescue vessel. Rescue comes on day 43 in the form of a merchant sloop that spots the signal fire and investigates, finding 41 emaciated pirates who have been reduced to skeletons by starvation. 6 crew members having died in the previous 2 weeks from a combination of malnutrition, dysentery, and simple surrender to the inevitable. The merchant captain is understandably suspicious of rescuing 41 pirates, who might decide to thank him by seizing his ship and killing his crew. But Captain Edward negotiates a deal. The pirates will pay for passage to the nearest port using their salvaged treasure. They'll work as crew during the voyage to earn their passage, and they'll swear on whatever they hold sacred that they won't engage in piracy against this particular merchant vessel or its captain ever. The merchant captain agrees because 41 starving men aren't much of a threat, and because the treasure they're offering is enough to make the risk worthwhile. And the pirates are loaded onto the sloop, along with as much salvage supplies and treasure as the ship can carry, without becoming dangerously overloaded. You board this rescue vessel with your treasure still hidden in your clothing, and you weigh probably 30 pounds less than you did when the hurricane hit. Your body having consumed its own muscle mass to stay alive, and you look like a walking corpse, which is essentially what you are. A corpse that hasn't finished dying yet. The voyage to the nearest port takes 6 days, and during those 6 days you're working as a regular crew member, hauling lines and setting sails and doing the work of sailing without the violence and theft that defined your pirate career. And you realize that you're actually good at this work, that the 5 months of piracy taught you skills that are valuable in legitimate maritime employment. And you begin to formulate a plan for what comes next. The nearest port turns out to be Charlestown in the Carolina colony, which is far enough from the Caribbean that your reputation as a pirate hasn't preceded you. And the merchant captain deposits the 41 survivors on the dock with a warning that if he ever sees any of you again, he'll report you to the authorities as pirates. And you understand that this is both a threat and a kind